You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. All right, we are back, and I'm excited because we have a little different topic this time. We were chatting about this. This came up in our office hours for the athletes teacher training, and it's a topic that there's currently a lot of research on, and a good chunk of it's on tennis. So it's near and dear to my heart. But it's this idea of, we named the podcast Calm Under Pressure because I think people understand that a little bit better. But this idea, as it's termed in the research, is choking under pressure, freezing or underperforming under high intensity situations, which I think is so applicable to so many different things, whether you're an athlete, whether you're a yoga teacher, whether you're a presenter, or even a student. I mean, there's a million different, I think, circumstances where you can see being calm under pressure being really important. And you probably already have an idea of some of the tie-ins that we'll get to later. We'll kind of break down the different ways this shows up. So I'm excited to be back with you.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited about this one because I think it has so many implications for basically everyone. This is not, as you're mentioning, for athletes. It's for performing artists, for the surgeon who really needs to perform at that very minute, for us giving presentations at work. And all of us are under pressure at some point, which can be, coming from any combination of things. Could be because you are in a competition if you're an athlete, or because you are facing some sort of audience, your client, or speaking to a big audience of people, or it's just very important for yourself, for your ego, or you expect some sort of reward from it that can be easily imagined also for the work scenario. So I think there is so many takeaways, not just for athletes, even though the research we're referring to today comes from sports science or sports psychology.
Right. And I know for me, it feels very personal too, because as a tennis player, I remember, most people don't know this about me, but when I was young, I used to play really competitively, and my dream was to be a professional tennis player. The problem was that every time I'd play, I really had a tough time mentally. And I remember my dad saying to me a lot, your biggest problem is in your head, kiddo. And like, it really stuck with me. And it kind of, unfortunately, he didn't realize it or mean for that to happen, but it actually magnified things and made it so much, it made me more aware of it, which made it worse. And at the time there wasn't really like the sports psychology realm, and people didn't really talk about this. So you can imagine it didn't help me. And I've never been someone who loved public speaking. I've gotten around it somehow, and we'll talk about techniques later. But for me, public speaking has never been fun. I'm the person that you go to a training or something, and everyone has to go around and say their name and a few words, and I'm like, my heart's pounding.
That is very hard to imagine though, but I hear you.
I know, and somehow I've learned to get over it, which we all can, which is the good news about this. And I'm glad that there's so much research, because it is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and really interesting to me as well. And a lot of different professions that it shows up in. So
yeah. And I think it's really great that you're starting off with this as well. So we're talking about specific techniques or tools or interventions today as well that might help in a situation like this. But we should also not forget that it's not just about that one moment in time, that one presentation, or when you have to say your name, or that one tennis serve. But as you also described it, freezing under pressure in that moment can really send you down that spiral of self-doubt and anxiety. And then at some point, you will maybe not put yourself into that position anymore, or into that situation. Or as an athlete, you might not take the big risk, or even as a presenter at work, you might just play it safe and not knock everyone's brains out with your super new approach to giving a presentation. So I think the long-term effects of that are also really, important, and I guess many of us are
Yeah.
familiar with that in some capacity. So I think those tools that we're talking about today, and also understanding the processes or the mechanisms behind it, can really be helpful for basically all of us.
And I feel that too. It's funny now, 30 years later, picking up tennis, and I can really consciously tell myself, hey, this doesn't matter. It's not important. I don't care. I really don't care if I win or lose, but all of that kind of the automations of this happening just kicks back in. And so it's really interesting now as an adult to get to look at that and have a little more maybe maturity and patience with it than I did a long time ago, but also more knowledge now and to see how those patterns kind of show up. And um yeah, so let's dive in.
Yes. Let's. Should we start with talking about what the current understanding in the research is on how this comes to play out, or what models there are, what kind of mechanisms are behind all of that?
I love that.
Is that
Yeah.
is that a good place? Yeah. So I think actually the one that has been more acknowledged most recently is the one that is kind of intuitive, or it makes a lot of sense. It's not as specific, but it's just being very, very much in a stress situation. So hyperarousal. The body seems to be in that situation of being highly stressed. It goes into danger mode, and all that comes with it, like having those clammy, sweaty hands, and the heartbeat goes up, and all of those things that come with it. So can be physiological and also be noticed in other capacities as well, such as being super stressed out, super aroused by that situation. That's, yeah, the most generic or the most general one maybe, but also one that we experience in everyday life probably. So that's one. And then there's two more models or mechanisms that are a bit more specific, maybe also a bit more specific to sports, but can also be translated to other scenarios. So one is becoming distracted. So the assumption is always that we perform the best, or we perform at our optimal level when we are at the perfect amount of arousal, but also when we have the perfect amount of focus. That means you should focus on the task at hand and not be pulled away from that. And when you get distracted in a sports scenario, kind of clear, you may hear the noisy crowd cheering, but you could also become distracted by internal worries, by your own thoughts, for instance. So distraction would lead you out of that optimal focus zone or optimal situation where you can really, yeah, make sure that you perform well, that you focus on what is at hand. And then the third one is called self-focus. What is meant by that is you're in that situation. Let's say you wanna prepare for your tennis serve, and then you become overly fixated on that movement and every step of the movement. And I'm not a tennis player, so you might have to chime in here. But kind of, I imagine like how, at which angle you hold your racket, or at what height you actually throw the ball, or something like that. So you become aware of the teeny tiny aspects of the movement. And then that kind of interferes with the automated process that you have been practicing. So this should be something fluid. This should be something that is automated to some degree, but you over focus on the movement. And that can get you out of that ideal focus zone as well, because then, yeah, you won't bring your performance at the highest degree. So those are kind of like the three major models that we have for choking under pressure.
Well, and I think it's that reminder, like we do it in yoga too, when there's a faulty mechanism of whatever sort, we kind of break things down. We slow down and we break it apart, but then eventually we have to put those pieces together. Like when we're doing isolated movements, the body doesn't move in isolations, but we retrain those isolations so that those parts of the system are kicking in the automation. And the idea is that eventually everything's happening as it should. We don't have to like walk around doing like TVA taps on and bug on the floor, to turn on our core when we're moving and lifting and doing things. We want those to be automation. So we want it to translate. And it's the same thing if you get too hyper focused on breaking down the situation, especially in a high performance situation, we can overly analyze things. And what we're seeing in the research is just that can, and I think it totally, all of these are very intuitive, makes sense, that it kind of disrupts that natural rhythm. And I think anyone who I think a lot of people who a lot of competitive athletes and a lot of competitive sports, maybe not all, but you can sense that too, where you're too absorbed in it. And then I think it also triggers some of that self-doubt too, potentially as well. So there can be an overlap of some of these things that can also kind of bleed together. But yeah,
Yeah,
so we've
they're
got
surely interdependent, and just because we're diving right into that last one a little bit more right away, I think a term that fits nicely with that one is just like paralysis by analysis. That's kind of like the headline for that last one, with breaking down the movements. And yeah, but we'll go more into detail as we talk about the different tools for all of them.
So we've got excessive arousal, we have distraction, and then we have this what we're going to call self-focus. So um, excessive excessive self-focus, too zoomed in.
Yes.
So let's dive into them. Right? Is there something you want
Yeah.
to explore there?
So there's luckily now a lot more research on different tools, different practices that one can use, typically right before being in that situation, but some of them also more generally, to prepare so that you do not freeze. And for the interventions that are related to reducing that excessive arousal, the goal just generally is, of course, down regulating. So down regulating your nervous system so that you are not in such a highly aroused state. That's kind of obvious, but it's a little more than that also, because it could also be training resilience. So kind of putting yourself, while you're preparing for it, putting yourself in a situation where you experience certain stressors and kind of get used to it a bit better up front. That's another goal of those interventions. And then also it's a little bit about reducing the feeling of pressure, for instance, by working on your mindset when it comes to that specific high stress situation. So those are the overarching goals when we talk about hyperarousal and choking under pressure.
I think those are such big topics in when we look at athletic training and sports psychology. We talk about it a little bit in the athletes teacher training because it is, I think, a really big part of where yoga teachers can intervene. I mean, obviously, we can help regulate the nervous system and kind of, I think, what I think of it is kind of just training that switch like a dimmer to be able to turn up or down on command versus being kind of subjected to, what our nervous system is doing. We know that we have that opportunity to intervene, especially as we become more familiar with, how we can influence our nervous system. And so there's so many great inputs here. Also, I think in yoga with just changing our mindset, and then a reminder too that there's a place for the stressors, right? Like I like that you said getting used to the stressors, because so many times in yoga we want to kind of like eliminate them. And I think that's fair because we spend so much of our lives in that sympathetic mode. So it's really kind of more counteracting that and learning the other side. But it's also reminding ourselves, coming back to the middle and saying, hey, like the stressors are there. That revs us up as an athlete. What we need is a balance of both sympathetic and parasympathetic. They have to come together. We kind of tend to think that it's one or the other, but we want the sympathetic, which is what revs us up and gets us going and helps us rise to the occasion, which is so obvious in athletes, especially in things like fighting and football, where the sympathetic is really dominant. But we also need to feel safe. There's a sense of safety that's important. So if you're familiar with the ventral vagal, which is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, also helps us be calm and clear and focused so that we have that sense of concentration and focus, which is so important. You can imagine different sports needing maybe a little different balance of the sympathetic versus that ventral vagal focus. But both needed all the time. So being able to train our athletes, with yoga is such a great way to do that, to not only train the parasympathetic, but also change the mindset and change that resilience of how these two kind of interact with that too.
Yeah, and I think, as you just said, I think sports, working with athletes is just a great reminder that sometimes that's rather simple how to put yourself in that situation and kind of practicing to rise to the occasion. And I mean, not all sports are as bring as much excitement maybe or as much of that sympathetic drive as fighting, but there's a nice story about Michael Phelps, so swimming, which in itself does not hold as much of that excitement as a fight maybe. But Michael Phelps is said to have been supported by his coach, in that his coach kind of at some point I think broke his goggles, or did something to his goggles. So he, at some competition, he had to swim blind. And of course, that was not a nice scenario for him. But later, during an Olympic race, he got some water into his goggles and basically had to swim blind again. And he said that the fact that they kind of trained that before, or he was being exposed to that stressor before, helped him to stay calm and to perform in that Olympic race. And I mean, we're not all Olympic athletes or training Olympic athletes, but it's just putting yourself into that situation of being watched while giving a presentation. And so you could film yourself before you do a presentation or a yoga class. So that's kind of similar. Or when I have a very important presentation, I actually give it to my husband first, which is sometimes so much more weird than giving it to a big audience. So I always think when I give a presentation to my husband, I'm so well prepared. I don't have to like fear any audience. That feels so much weirder. So that's something that helps me. Steve Jobs also has been said to extensively practice his presentations before. And I think also we're talking about yoga as yoga teachers. When you're a new yoga teacher, when you're in a specific scenario, auditioning for for a class spot at a studio or at that conference, or in first time teaching in a yoga teacher training, practice is just something that really helps. I'm a big
Yeah.
practicer.
Yeah. I mean, I am too. And whether I'm teaching 10 people or 1,000, I know for me, I kind of have to, and I've never really thought this through as much as kind of when we were thinking about this show, but I have to kind of have an idea of what I'm doing and my purpose for me. And it's kind of, I think, one of the things that really differentiates yoga medicine teachers too, is having this purpose driven material, even if that's just a well-rounded class, or maybe it's down regulating the nervous system or something else very specific. I have to have that clarity in my purpose going into it, because I think what it does is it deflects that hyperarousal, which is my tendency to go in front of even a small group of people and to feel that nervousness. But as soon as I focus on what's important, which is, hey, I'm here to help them learn, I'm here to share this information, help them feel this in their body, being able to kind of change that and have that focus, and for me, a visualization of like, okay, I'm usually kind of visualizing, not for long periods, but visualizing how it's going to feel and what I'm going to do, and maybe not every pose, because as teachers we adapt to the people in front of us, of course, but having a visualization of the outcome too. So for me, that's really been important, and it's just kind of become a process that isn't necessarily something I like planned, but it's become a part of me, I guess.
And I think what you're describing, especially that intention behind what you're saying and remembering why you're doing that, I think that comes back to mindset as well. And in preparing for that presentation, incidentally, I came across a couple of tennis examples because I knew that you can relate to those quite well. And I actually found a book by a tennis legend, which is Billie Jean King, who
Oh,
was a huge
love her.
name and still is in the name of tennis,
Yeah,
and fought for equal rights for female tennis players and fought in a battle of the sexes back in the 70s, and that
so
became
iconic.
very popular. Yeah,
Yeah.
iconic. That's it. And the book title I'm talking about is called Pressure is Privilege, and I think that kind of translates to that as well. Understanding any
Yeah.
situation of teaching, presenting, performing in that capacity, as an opportunity to share what you have worked on and what you're passionate about, and transforming that into something positive, into something that you, yeah, are passionate about and want to do. And of course that can come with some sort of arousal, and we know that some sort of arousal is also beneficial. So if you're like bored as hell almost falling asleep on the couch, that's not going to bring you your optimal performance in that moment.
Right.
But the overall mindset, why am I doing this? And it's really cool that I have the opportunity to do so. I think that can help and just calm you and be part of that, yeah, calming process, and regulating the nervous system as well. It's more cognitive, but it can really help you calm down,
Yeah.
and use that in adjunct with breathing, or maybe a meditation technique you like, or some sort of mindfulness moment you have that helps you to anchor and calm down, and bring yourself a little bit down from that sympathetic arousal in that moment.
I think that's such a perfect one. Pressure is a privilege. I remember seeing that at the US Open when the players, right before they'd walk out, there's a plaque with that on it too. And it's
Mm,
such a great, succinct way to remember, like, hey, I'm here for a purpose. And, you know, I can't imagine what it's like to be a professional tennis player on that kind of stage, but like, I'm here to do my best and, and enjoy it. To me, like, I just enjoy the points or enjoy sharing what I've come to find with my students and, really appreciating that. So it's really, training that resilience and being able to rise to the occasion and put it in perspective, which is so important. And I love that.
yeah, and I think some of those techniques that we just chatted about, so those were all related to those excessive arousal aspects of choking under pressure. Some of them we can take right into the next category, which was distraction. So, tools for becoming distracted, because many of those tools focus on staying in the present moment. So, not become distracted. And I think some of the ones that we just mentioned, some like breathing or mindfulness technique, stuff like that, taking a deep breath, or counting yourself down the moments before you do that tennis serve, for instance. Those are all related to connecting to the present moment. And I think there's a lot of overlap between that hyperarousal and then being able to stay in that present moment and not go off tangent with your thoughts and emotions. So I think that second group of interventions or tools, trying to bring the distraction down and bring your focus to the task at hand, they have, yeah, some same roots
Yeah.
or aspects to them.
Well, and I think just as a kind of reminder too, when we look at the arousal, the first group, to all of this work around visualization, which I think, we could talk about a lot. And I just think we can easily succinctly just summarize as visualization, and we can use a lot in our meditation practices. Can have a little bit of overlap because I think a lot of the meditation practices actually work into this distraction category, the second category, which is keeping us present. So just a slight shift, like one is visualizing, to try and capture that response and prepare the nervous system and that arousal, the appropriate arousal response, versus that distractibility and really being able to train that present moment awareness. As a yoga teacher, very similar, they're both meditation, both things we talk a lot about in our meditation teacher training, but also now adding in just kind of a little bit of that nuance of detail. If I know that someone's more uh, distractible or more hyper aroused in an athletic setting, then I can be a little bit more targeted to that potentially as well.
Yeah, and I think it also maybe another distinction we can make is when we think about distraction, that could be related to being distracted by some external source. So we mentioned it before, a noisy crowd or what your opponent is doing, or if your computer setup, technical setup for the presentation isn't fully done yet, right the moments before you get started. But it could also be internal distraction. So focusing on your worries or on noticing that you do have sweaty hands. And then it's not the sweaty hands per se, but it's noticing them and then getting worried about what's happening with you internally, what's happening physiologically. So more that I would maybe put it together as or summarize it by worrying. A lot of worrying is related to that. And when we kind of just make the distinction between those two, we can also take some of the tools and kind of look at that from that perspective, either aiming
Yeah.
to be able to focus in the present moment to tune out the external cues or disturbances, or reducing those internal disturbances you might have.
And I think there's quite a bit of overlap, especially with athletes between these two. So, I think it doesn't always have to be teased out. Sometimes it can be possible to and use it, as tools as needed. But I think it's also just really helpful to, as a yoga teacher, train the nervous system to be able to self-regulate and adjust as needed, train that visualization, train that present moment awareness so that I can cover those bases. And then, as an athlete, and I think this is one of a million reasons why yoga for athletes has become so popular. Yoga has become so popular with athletes, is because there is that variability. And, as athletes get more familiar with the spectrum of tools available, even within something like meditation, they can start to then pull out the ones that are helpful for them. And the first step, like most things, is just noticing when it's
Mhm.
happening, becoming aware of it, and then being able to try on some of these techniques for size. And we won't go into detail on the specifics because we're talking very generally and broadly, about, I think for nervous system regulation, it could be a lot of things other than meditation. We know that there's a lot of, we talk about this a lot in the nervous system training too, of like restorative yoga. For some people, that's yin yoga. For some people, that's pranayama. I think the key is finding the tool that works best for the person you're working with. Everyone has something, especially initially, that clicks with them more. And as we practice yoga more, you might find other tools that work better or in addition to. But I think it's also just tuning the athlete into, hey, I have resources here if I can slow things down. And I think most athletes have experienced that feeling of time slowing down in their sport, and then being able to interject that at times so that now they can start to, you know, piece things together differently, or interject a brief moment of breathing awareness, which obviously would need to be somewhat familiar to them. So having a yoga practice with some of these things outside of it, but there's, I think, so many intervention points as a yoga teacher, just by, again, if you can break it down, or maybe there's a couple of these that are connecting and using both.
Yeah, and in either way, just having that toolbox ready and then finding what works for them, yeah, surely is the way to go for athletes and for all of us. And just wanted to kind of focus on or mention some of the more specific techniques maybe that are not necessarily inherent to what we typically think of in yoga when we want to support athletes or any kind of high stress situation. But what has really been proven to be super effective with athletes in the choking under pressure literature were those pre-performance routines. So they have shown to be working really well. And just to give you an example of that in the sports world, in tennis, of course. So Nadal is known to
He's the
have this
master.
multi-step thing where he pulls a little bit on his shorts and then does some twitches and tweaks around his shoulders and face and ear. It's a whole thing. I don't know how many steps
And
it
it is
has, but
always identical. I mean, if you look closely, a lot of players have it. I think I
mhm.
was watching Djokovic at the US Open. I think it's like 5 times he bounces his ball usually, like it can be something really simple like that. So And we were talking about this before we started too. What we're talking about is something you do like immediately before it starts. And there's not a lot of specificity around what that needs to be, but it's finding your ritual that
Yeah.
reminds you, that kind of drops you into that present moment focus again.
Yes. It's really, side note, in preparation for this, I actually did put in, I Googled, I think pre-performance routine tennis players, and there's like, you can watch like 10 minutes of different pre-serve routines, which is so interesting. It's just really interesting to watch whether you play tennis or not. It's just interesting, as you were mentioning, to see the variability in this. Everyone is just finding their thing. And it's the same with any of us. It might be that one word you're saying to yourself just before you get started, or it might be like a little hand thing or touching, I don't know, piece of jewelry you have or something. So
Or
it could be anything.
like for yoga teachers, I know for me, mine is just taking a couple of deep breaths. A lot of times I'll like go to the bathroom just because I don't ever want to have to go to the bathroom. I'm always afraid I'm gonna have to pee during a class, which never happens. But and then like that moment of having a moment to myself, whether that's in a back room or in a bathroom, where I can just take a couple of breaths and again focus on my purpose, like take a moment, and it has to be succinct. So maybe it's a feeling, maybe it's a word, but there's a couple of deep breaths. So just taking a couple of deep breaths or slow exhalations is a common one. That could be a mantra that you have in your head too, potentially. So there's so many different ways this can show up as a speaker, as a yoga teacher, as an athlete.
Yeah, or even like for your kids. I think when I know that my husband, when he was younger, he had this little play hippo. So when he was in school and got nervous about a test, and he had the hippo with him and just touched the hippo.
Oh,
And I mean, we were laughing about it when we were adults and kind of remembering the hippo, because at some point when we moved together, the hippo, it still moved with us, and at some point we threw it out, the hippo.
oh.
I wish we hadn't. Now I think it was so cute. But like even giving your
Well,
kids something like that before they have to perform at school might be something nice, and to think about.
yeah. I think
Yeah.
Lulu served that purpose to me a little bit too. I don't know that I
Hmm.
was aware of it, but like having a dog, having a pet,
Yeah.
pets, animals, whether it's a stuffed animal or a live one, there's something about animals for a lot of people, for me especially, that just like instant soothing. So
Yeah.
it could be a lot
Surely.
of things. I love that
Yeah.
tie-in.
So, and then when it comes to that distraction right before, there is a multitude of things that we just discussed that bring you back to the present moment and bring you into that focus and attention, so that you're, bringing your attention to the task at hand. But that could also be something that comes way before. So there's a couple of interventions in the research that are more focused on kind of reframing or getting rid of those internal worries, mostly before. So expressive writing has been discussed for athletes, writing down their fears, writing down what they're worried about, or what the worst case scenario is, or just any sort of free expressive writing when it comes to those situations. And that has been shown to be helpful. And there's still research coming out on those expressive writing tasks kind of constantly. So that is something that could also be easily translated to all of us, like writing down what you're stressed about, maybe even just before you go to bed, when you have something big coming up the next day, and that might help you, get to sleep better, but also help you for that situation, because you kind of have thought it through already and have gotten it out of your system. And then a second one is reframing again. So not so much about the overall mindset, about finding the intention behind it or so, what we discussed before, but kind of understanding that if you have clammy hands or if your heart rate goes up, that this is just a natural response of your nervous system. So it's not about the degree of arousal itself, but understanding it and appreciating it and knowing that it is okay to be aroused, and you don't have to worry to feel the adrenaline coming up in you, because you know that this there is an optimal level of arousal. So before we were talking about how to kind of decrease that arousal. And now when it comes to distractions and to worrying in the situation of performance, it's about understanding and reframing what is happening to you and knowing that it's okay and you can kind of let go of that worry. And I like
Yeah.
these as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also I feel like it's that moment of tuning in, that presence of like feeling that aliveness, feeling your body rise to the occasion rather than feeling like it's a bad thing, like it's a stressor. So it's kind of shifting that. So
Yeah.
we've looked at arousal, we looked at distraction. Let's talk about the last one, which is a little different now because it's not as much around the mindfulness and meditation and breathing practices, though I think, that can help in a lot of different ways for all of these, maybe potentially. But we're looking at a very different one, which is that self-focus, which you titled this kind of paralysis by analysis really succinctly, I think. So we're looking at a little different way of intervening here.
Yeah, it's a bit more related to motor performance, so to movements, the research that we know about it. So it's about over focusing on those on every aspect of the movement. Like we said, breaking down what is going to happen when I do that serve, and thereby kind of taking that automatic movement process away, and thereby also probably experiencing a decrement of performance because you need that sort of automation. We talked about that initially. And in the research, there are a couple of interventions that are aimed to reduce that. And one of them is, and I think that's really interesting, is left hand contractions if you're right-handed. So if you are a right-handed tennis player, the idea would be, for instance, to squeeze your ball, a soft ball, for 30 seconds or so. And what you aim to do with that is to prime your right hemisphere, so right hemisphere of your brain, which you need for those motor tasks, and kind of draw away the attention or suppress the processes of the more analytical left hemisphere. So you kind of want to get out of that thinking head and into the movement head, so to say, to get out of that being stuck in analysis or paralysis by analysis. And that has proven to be helpful for any sort of motor task. So that could, again, be interesting for the performing artist who's playing an instrument, or for the surgeon who needs to perform with their hands, or for the athlete. So anyone who's right-handed might profit from that. That's one. And it's a bit more specific, but I think you could try that out also when teaching yoga or when doing any sort of movement related task. And then there's a second one that's rather specific, which is quiet eye training. So it's focusing on some sort of succinct spot right before the performance. And the idea, again, is to kind of be more implicit. So not thinking or focusing about the technical execution of the task, but kind of draw your attention away from that. And I think those two, we can also easily transfer to other scenarios as well.
Well, and I think the details of this last one, I think this last one's really interesting. To me, this is kind of the details of sports psychology. And there's so much information coming about this quiet eye training and specificity that I think is almost out of our scope as yoga teachers. I think it's a great, like thing to ask about. Have you tried this? Or maybe, especially if you're working with someone if I were working with a pro athlete, I probably wouldn't mention these things unless I was just like, have you tried this thing? Because I know they're working with a sports psychologist. But if I'm working with a weekend warrior or someone who's, full-time job and then, competes for fun, I might mention these things. But the details are so can be very specific. And there's a lot of quiet eye training, talk about quiet eye training in tennis. Like even just there's that moment when you toss the ball up for your serve where you're fixated on the ball before you hit it, specific things like that might come from their coach or their sports psychologist. So I think, this one can be interesting as a yoga teacher to tap into yourself or to mention to clients, but there's I think less of the specific yoga interventions, but a lot of interesting information. I mean,
Yeah. And there's a last one. I'm just mentioning it because it's in the research. The idea would be if someone is learning a new movement, and I think that could be relevant when you train kids in sports, it's minimizing the explicit knowledge about the movement. So not explaining the angle of the racket to them when you practice serves, but work with metaphors or work with some sort of analogies that are appropriate for biomechanics, so they do not get stuck in that technical knowledge. It's harder when someone knows their stuff, and a pro athlete definitely would. But if you work with other more recreational athletes or kids and you're teaching them something, that might also be or could be helpful potentially.
The analogies are so beneficial. I mean, I think in yoga too, like I think about a lot of times that I don't teach crow that much anymore, but when I do, I think that thigh master analogy versus like talking about angles of your legs or what they're doing. I think analogies can be so great in yoga too, because it's such a succinct way to talk about more complex
Yeah.
biomechanics or activations in the system. And in yoga, especially, like we have to be succinct. And then we see it's also tying into these automations, which are important as well. And streamlining things here.
Yeah. So lots of tools. Some are very specifically related to athletics, but I feel many of those could be translated to all kinds of scenarios for yoga teachers, for your work life, for your personal endeavors in any new field or any situation where you're put under pressure. So I hope this was helpful, or could just, give you a nice overview of tools or ideas, that interventions that could be applied.
And such a great reminder of the mental component of what we do in yoga, because I think it's so easy to get fixed. There's so much you can focus on in the physical realm and the energetic realm and the spiritual realm. There's so many layers, which is what I think brings us all back to yoga for decades and years. But I think this mental component of it is interesting in athletes and life, and looking at these kind of three different ways, because I think we've all experienced this, needing to be calm under pressure, and probably everyone has struggled with it to some extent, whether that was very brief or something ongoing, to kind of be able to break down, is it a hyper arousal? Is it distractibility? Is it excessive self focus? So that I can kind of be able to see, can I add in more of those nervous system regulating practices for the hyperarousal to help kind of be able to tune, unlock my ability to kind of more easily dim up or down the nervous system when needed, and to also appreciate the heightening of the nervous system in athletic endeavors or in presentations and exams. When we're teaching, there is some of that as well too, although I think it does depend on what class you're teaching, probably, and probably a lot less than athletes. But, do I need more of that nervous system arousal component with things like meditation and restorative and yin practices and visualization, which I'm a huge fan of? I think is such a very powerful one in sports, and I use a ton in sports and in life, in business, in life, in yoga. Like, to me, it is a really important technique that I use a lot, and not even necessarily like in formal practices, but even just in moments of my life. But then we see that meditation bleed over into the distraction focus as well. So that mindfulness of present moment awareness, and breathing exercises to really bring us into that present moment awareness. So that could be whatever works for you. That could be deep breathing. That could be a mantra. That could be reframing things. That could be meditation and mindfulness practices. There's a lot of tie into yoga there, and then the self focus, which was a little less of the yoga tie-ins, but I think also an important one, especially in sports, probably most applicable in sports. But being able to look at some of the cool new research coming out on quiet eye training and left hand contractions, and minimizing that explicit knowledge of movement to be more automated and intuitive, right? Which is we see in yoga too. Like, we can overly break things down, but at some point we need to feel that flow of movement from one pose to another, especially in a vinyasa practice. So this is great. I hope lots of helpful takeaways for people, whether you're teaching yoga or teaching something else or an athlete. whether you're taking up a sport later in life or coming back to it like myself and just wanting to appreciate it more, or whether you're working with professional athletes who want to really hone in on a lot of the specifics here. So lots of great resources in here to experiment with. And if you want more, we've got more in our athletes teacher training and our meditation teacher training, our nervous system teacher training. I think all of those are really great adjuncts for our teachers who have already taken them. You can imagine there's a lot of ways to now kind of tie in. I like whether you start in the podcast with us or start in the trainings, all of it kind of, as we learn more, it makes more sense of the things we already know. And it's one thing at Yoga Medicine we believe is so important, rather than teaching you guys a cookie cutter way of teaching or sequencing or flowing, that we really empower you with information to understand what, why, and how. And in this circumstance, more specifically for training the mental mindset and our ability to be calm under pressure. So, thanks for bringing the research again, Katja. As always, lots of great stuff in here. I hope you guys enjoy it. We love hearing from you. So feel free to comment on YouTube or on Instagram or wherever you like. And we look forward to chatting again. Thanks, Katja.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.